This podcast contains mature content, violence, and coarse language. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. Don't say we didn't warn you. Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. This week, we are getting into part 2 of my series on Robert Hansen, who is Alaska's most prolific serial killer. Awful guy. I don't have anything much to say. If you are enjoying this channel, if you just got here, please subscribe to it. That would be dope. Give me a like or a comment. That would also be dope. Thank you. And if you are interested, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at grimweekly.com. The newsletter is called Grim Weekly, and it is a grim collection of true crime news and stuff. So yeah, I'll get into a recap of last week's episode. Last week we talked about Robert Hansen, his pretty shitty upbringing. His father was super strict with him, and he made him work at his bakery and basically forced him to become a baker. He also forced him to become right-handed. He also had pretty severe acne and a stutter and didn't do well with women. I don't know about you, but it does not sound like the worst I've ever heard. Just saying. We also talked about Cindy Paulson, street name Kitty Larson, and her childhood actually seemed way worse than Robert's. I don't know much about it, but she was on the streets and she was 12, so that's worse. Anyway, her horrific encounter with Robert Hansen, she claimed that he kidnapped her, held her at gunpoint to his home, raped her in his basement, held her up for 5 hours, and then attempted to bring her onto his airplane. And he said he was going to take her out to this cabin he had in the woods. And thankfully, she was able to escape with her life. But Robert ended up providing an alibi when later questioned about this by the police. The police now had Glenn Floth on the case, one of the detectives, and he was looking into Robert for a number of things. Once he had the Cindy Paulson case, he kind of started connecting it to these 2 other bodies that they had found out in the Alaska wilderness near the Nick River. It seemed like Robert also had a very shady past with some other arrests and stuff, and nothing kind of ever stuck with him. And he dug up quite a bit, which I talked about last episode. So from this point on, we will start back into Glenn's investigation. Glenn Floth had a lot of circumstantial evidence, most of which we talked about last episode, and a lot of speculation. And he really believed that Robert Hansen was their guy, and so he put him under 24-hour surveillance. Floth had dug into an insurance claim that Robert made after an alleged burglary at his home. Robert had claimed that somebody broke in and stole a bunch of his hunting and world record trophies, which we talked about last episode. And Floth believed that Robert had faked the burglary and used the insurance money to buy a new airplane. Right after he got the $13,000 in insurance money, he purchased himself a new airplane. He knew that if they were able to search Robert's home and they found some or all of the items that he claimed had been stolen, they could get him on insurance fraud, and at least that would lock him up, and it would be just a good add-on bonus. Now, Floth knew that Robert was super into stealing shit. We recall the chainsaw incident and his other, he seemed to be very klepto. And he actually also found some people kind of out in the boonies, out in the Australian wilderness, who had cabins out there, who had claimed that they'd been robbed by a man with an airplane who used the airplane for the robbery. And guess who they accused by name? Our boy Robert Hansen, of course. Now, Floth just needed proof. Perhaps by searching Robert's home, they would be able to find some of the stolen items. Now, meanwhile, Cindy Paulson had left town and she'd moved to Seattle. And Floth was trying his best to track her down, but it was not easy. He had to spend many nights out on the street talking with different sex workers and people in that trade to try to track her down. And of course, those people are not super trusting of police, so it was quite the feat when he actually found her and was able to get her story again. So she sat down with him and she told him her story in even greater detail than she had previously. Floth really felt that she was telling the truth, and it was just this alibi, this like very suspicious alibi. And interestingly, he actually talked about how she was probably the best witness that he ever had. And I think this is due to just like the sheer amount of time that she spent in his basement. Remember, she was tied up for 5 hours, so she really got to take in her surroundings, and like the entire experience really just like soaked into her mind, I'm sure, in those 5 hours. But even with everything that they had at this point, the DA still refused to issue a warrant. It was the damn alibi. Now, Floth went back to the drawing board. He talked to another DA, like a neighboring DA from like a different town or whatever, who was ready to back him, who like bought into this whole thing. And he also called up the behavioral analysis unit, the FBI behavioral analysis unit in Quantico. I'm sure most of you are familiar. And there he spoke to Roy Hazelwood, a very well-known criminal profiler. Remember, Roy was at the Atlanta child murders. And after giving Roy a couple details about the victims and the crime scene, like Roy just like on the phone was like, oh, here's the profile. And like it was Robert Hansen to a T. Now that was obviously super unofficial. It was just them chatting, but it got the BAU super interested in sending somebody out to do an official profile. And yeah, at this time, like we're fresh off the Atlanta child murders. The BAU is like still pretty new. They're like super interested in tracking all these different serial killers. So they're like super interested in this. Floth was determined to get the DA to see things his way. The BAU sent 2 agents, one of them being John Douglas, and they did an official profile on the serial killer. And again, this came back to the exact description of Robert Hansen, down to like the fact that he was a hunter, the fact that he had a stutter, and that he resented women. While profiling their killer and everything, the agents guessed that their unsub would be the type to keep mementos. They figured that, again, if they were able to do a search of his home, Robert's home, they would very likely find items that were linked to the victims. Remember, Robert Hansen was a trophy hunter. He loved keeping memorabilia from his successful hunts. His entire basement was decked out in his trophies, so it was really not a stretch to guess that Robert was doing the same thing with these women if he was the killer. And it would be very strong circumstantial evidence to find a little treasure trove of mementos. Now, despite all of this evidence, which, I mean, admittedly, it does sound, I'm sure it sounds much more compelling in, book form, when you're just like listening to witness testimony and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it is different when you get down to like exactly like what you can use with a warrant and everything. Regardless, I do think it was still compelling. But Vic Crum, not Vikram, Vic Crum, the Anchorage district attorney, was still skeptical. And I don't think it was that he didn't believe any of it or that he like wasn't kind of buying into it, but he was really afraid that if they locked up Hansen on the robbery or fraud charges, which is really all that they had that was solid, then the murder evidence that they might collect during the search warrant would be thrown out for whatever reason, and then they would have a real problem and they wouldn't be able to charge him for murder. Now, this could happen, especially if they got the warrants for the robbery and the fraud charges and then took evidence of murder in those searches. A judge could easily decide not to allow the murder evidence as it was seized under non-murder pretenses. On top of that, this warrant would have to go through the Office of Special Prosecutions and Appeals, and it would be a bit of an unusual warrant because instead of making a list of very specific items that they were looking for during their search like a normal warrant, they would have to ideally include very general descriptions, for example, mementos or implements of murder, instead of like what exactly they were looking for. And this was another aspect that would leave them vulnerable to getting evidence thrown out or being appealed later. And so, somewhat understandably, Vikram, was like, we need more solid stuff. But also, like, there's this other DA who's like, no, of course, I'd like, because it's not the DAs that issue the warrants, it's the DAs that, like, okay all the stuff, and then the judge grants the warrant. But anyway, Vic Crum seemed very conservative in all this stuff, more so than other people, it seemed to me. Now, regardless, Vic Crum is not wrong. Like, this, it is a risk. What they were doing was a risk without having more solid evidence. But I think that Floth figured that the risk that the evidence would get destroyed altogether was worse, which he knew that Robert would do if he ever had a clue that someone was onto him. See, Floth was going around and, like, talking to his acquaintances and, like, looking really hard into the sky, and his biggest fear was that somebody would alert Robert to this, and then Robert would just destroy everything. And that would really suck. In the end, Crum relented and set them up with an attorney named Gail Voigtlander. Now, Floth went back over everything with Gail and the team, and they still had the 24-hour surveillance on Hansen. And interestingly, one of the undercover guys who'd been following Robert actually began chatting with Hansen about hunting and flying while secretly surveying him at the airport. We love a little undercover moment. Love that. Hansen was at the airport, and he was just getting back from a hunting trip with his son. Obviously, like, they were tailing him the whole time, so they, like, were there and they saw him leave, and then when he came back, they're like, okay, let's chat him up. The agent started talking to Hansen and asking a bunch of questions, pretending to be another hunting enthusiast. And Hansen told the agent that he had lots of guns and told him that his favorites were small caliber, high velocity bullets. He also mentioned in this conversation that he reloaded his own ammunition, like that was a thing that he did, and that he spent a lot of time hunting near the Nick River. Everything continued to point directly at Robert Hansen. They also had a doctor go through all of Hansen's previous psychological records, and he determined that it was very logical to conclude that Hansen could end up committing the types of crimes that he was being accused of. His entire history, he's got a history of, like, arson and stealing things and attacking women. So, I mean, I don't know that you needed a professional to tell you that, but they got one. Mostly this guy noted his impulsiveness and, as I said, arson at a young age, the love of hunting, and choosing victims who he deemed inferior. He also noted that since Hansen had a family, it was very likely that he would keep mementos of his at his place of work. Interesting. Now, Floth kept going. He spoke to old acquaintances and hunting buddies of Hansen's, and he was very tactical about this, as the risk of Hansen finding out was obviously very high and something he wanted to avoid. Finally, he was able to get everything in front of a judge. This was the real moment of truth. Everything that Floth had been working towards, he'd put his entire reputation onto this, not to mention he truly believed that Robert Hansen was a serial murderer, and rapist who was preying on women. So, like, the stakes were very high. The judge took one look at all of Floth's stuff, his affidavit, and he granted a search warrant for Robert's home, Robert's bakery, his airplane, and the home of John Henning, who, if we recall, was the person who gave the main alibi for the Cindy Paulson situation. And no questions asked. This was a big win, huge. They would go to Robert's bakery when they knew that he was working and take him in for an interview at that time. So that was the plan, and everything went according to plan. They showed up at the bakery, asked for Robert, and he went quietly with them, no issues. And they really hoped that that would be the last time that Robert saw the outside of a prison. And we'll see if that is the case. Now, at the same time that they were at the same time that they had, I guess, they hadn't arrested Robert, but they were taking him in. They served the search warrant at the bakery, which is where they took him from. They served the search warrant at the home. They went to John Henning's home. They, started everything. At the Hansen residence, Darla was there, his wife, and she was teaching a group of children, so that wasn't ideal. And she was also entertaining her mother-in-law. I guess that was Robert Hansen's mother. And it took a while to get all the children picked up, and then poor Darla had to go down to the station as well. And it was very clear that she really didn't have any idea what was going on. This was extremely overwhelming. I think a part of her was like, oh, fuck, Robert did something again. But I don't think she was like, he's a serial killer. But in any case, she was very shaken, as was the mother-in-law. The employees at the bakery had to be sent home, and I'm sure that's probably how a lot of word got out, as they probably just went and told everyone. And then everyone got to looking around. While the searches were getting underway, Robert's interrogation was about to begin. Down at the station, at the advice of the FBI profilers, they set up the interrogation room in a very specific way. They had a big map with big red X's noting the locations of the bodies. They had stacks of files with names of his hunting associates and a big file with Darla's name on it, all laid out so that Robert had to look at it while he waited. And all of this was obviously intended to make Robert nervous. They sat him in the room with all of this stuff and made him wait for like 15 minutes before they began. And I mean, if you've ever watched anything, or if you've ever read anything by John Douglas, or if you watched Mindhunter, or even probably like Criminal Minds or whatever, you know that this is a tactic used by the BAU to try to get serial killers to talk to them, or anyone, I guess. This was definitely their suggestion. Fascinating. Love it. It's so theatrical. I fucking love it. Now, after they let him sit there and wait and look at all their set for a while, the investigators came in and they started chatting with Robert. They started slowly and casually with the questions. They were not able to ask him anything about Cindy Paulson. And the reason for that is because during the initial investigation of Cindy Paulson, when they were interrogating him then, it got to the point where he asked for a lawyer. So if they were to ever bring up anything about Cindy Paulson, it would instantly trigger the fact that a lawyer needed to be present. And obviously they wanted to avoid that. So they couldn't ask anything about her. They had to stick to everything else, of which there was quite a bit. Robert answered the questions, but he remained very vague. He still claimed that all of the incidents with the different women were disputes over money. Obviously, no one was buying that. He spoke very poorly about all of the sex workers, and it was clear that Robert had some very, initially I said old-fashioned views, but it's not even old-fashioned. It's I guess, in a way it is, but he very much felt that like they were beneath him, and like because they were sex workers, their lives just did not mean as much as somebody else's. To him, it was very clear that like all women fit into two categories, like they were either saints or they were whores. And this was something that the profilers had figured and guessed. Robert hugely resented women because they weren't particularly interested in him, and that is why they predicted that he went after prostitutes. To Robert, they were bad women. They were, I don't know if I'd say evil, but they were like the representation of everything wrong with women. They were women who took advantage of men like him because they knew that they had something that he wanted, which is pretty rich if you think about it, but unfortunately, it seems to be a pretty common mindset among men of this, I don't know, this situation, serial killers. As the detectives began to question him about specifics and then outright accuse him of lying and of murder, Robert Hansen maintained his innocence. And he acted like the whole thing was just some sort of misunderstanding, like he was kind of calm about it, although, you know, he was stuttering and denying and everything. The detectives told Robert that they had matched the shell casings found at both murder scenes to his gun. Now, this was a lie. They hadn't tested them yet, and they didn't even have the specific gun that they were looking for yet to compare to the casings. But Robert didn't know this. He tried to argue that he had hunted in the area all the time, so it's very possible that his shell casings just happened to land where they also found these dead bodies, which is, I'm sure, something that a defense attorney would argue in court, but like, come on, yeah, right. Still, Robert persisted. He admitted to soliciting prostitution, and he admitted that he had a very shady a very shady past, which he very much regretted, allegedly. He blamed his run-ins with the law on the fact that girls didn't like him and that he had acne and blah, blah, blah. But that is about as much as he would admit to. Even after they told him that they were going to be going through his house, he still didn't say anything, which I guess kind of led them to believe that either he didn't have things there or they were hidden really well and they wouldn't find them. And I think that's true. I think that Robert guessed that they were having a very hard time over at this house. So the search was going on, and during the first 14 hours of the search, it wasn't super promising. Here is what they found. An aviation map hidden behind the headboard of his waterbed. Why did everybody have a waterbed? And why does nobody have them anymore? Anyway, it was just a regular map, but for some reason it was hidden, so they took it and thought maybe it was something of evidentiary value. They found a disguise kit, including a fake mustache and adhesive. They found ace bandages, which we recall they found in one of the murder sites. Multiple hidden sacks of cash. All the trophies and taxidermy heads that he'd claimed were stolen, so that was the insurance fraud case there. They also found a number of items that they thought were probably involved in the burglary cases that Robert was suspected of, but, they weren't positive. And lastly, there was a lot of guns, like a lot of guns. Not the specific gun that they were looking for, however. So it was definitely enough that they could arrest Robert on the fraud charges, but there was no evidence that they found linking him to any murders at this point. And here's what they were specifically looking for. The rifle that they knew was used in the murders, and this was a .223 caliber Mini 14. This gun, I believe, is kind of similar to an AK-47, which is similar to a lot of guns. It's a rifle, but that's, I think, probably the most popular thing that people might know was an AK-47. They typically look something like this, which is what they believe the murder weapon is. Now, during Robert's interrogation, they kept asking him where that specific gun was. He admitted that he had it, and he would tell them a location, and then every time they looked in it, it wasn't there. So it kind of seemed like he was trying to fuck with them. They were also looking for mementos, specific jewelry from the victims. They knew that Sherry Morrow, for example, had a gold arrow pendant necklace that she was known to wear and that was never found with her body. So they had they took a pretty good guess that they would be able to find that specific necklace and really hoped that they would be able to find it. And of course, based on the FBI analysis, they believed that there would be more. But alas, after 14 hours, they hadn't found any of it. And of course, they looked in the bakery and didn't find anything there. Back in the interrogation room, Robert was getting fed up, and he finally requested a lawyer after hours and hours and hours. As soon as that happened, they had to stop questioning him, of course. They took his hair and saliva DNA samples, and then they locked him up on the insurance fraud and burglary and the rape charges, but not murder. And they knew that he knew that meant that they didn't have anything on the murders. His bail was set at $500,000, which he didn't have, so he stayed. And now after that, they were coming to an end of their search at the Hansen home. And the last section that they were going to look at was the attic or little crawl space up at the very top. And this was just a very tiny, unfinished, pretty much just wooden beams with insulation. And one guy was sent up there, he shimmied on up there, and he just systematically searched between every beam. And it wasn't until he got to the very last section that he found what they'd been looking for. There were a number of hunting rifles, including the 14 Mini, and there was a pile of jewelry, among which was a specific necklace that they were looking for with the gold arrow pendant. And there was also another map, and this one had red X's all over it, marking specific locations. Back at the station, Darla had just been released. She had no idea what was going on, but she was interviewed by the detectives. The detectives were still trying to track down John Henning. They'd been to his home, and they'd tracked down his wife, who like had driven by the Hansen home to check it out, and they're like, hey, come talk to us. She seemed to know something, but she refused to talk, and apparently John was working in King Salmon and refusing to come back to talk to the police. King Salmon is another place in Alaska. It's like a short plane ride away. So Robert was locked up, and the like laws at the time, I don't know if they're still like this, but basically they had 4 months to pull everything together that they needed to put Robert in front of a judge. Otherwise, he would walk on the murder charges. They had enough already for the fraud charges, but essentially, like, that's when the trial needed to start. Which is a very short amount of time, given that they had to kind of go through all of the evidence. So what they did was they started preparing for a grand jury. I've talked about grand juries before. If you're unfamiliar with what a grand jury is, it's kind of like a mock trial to get a jury to decide whether or not there's enough evidence to have an actual trial. While they were preparing for this, they got ready, and this is what they did. They had the FBI conduct and compare the shell casings found at the 2 murder scenes to the gun found at Robert's home, and ding, 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 that was a match. And just as a side note, matching an actual bullet is actually better evidence, or I guess the whole bullet with the shell casing is better than just the shell casing, which is what they had, but they didn't have the bullets. So the best they could do was matching the shell casings. They just went in knowing that it wasn't like totally ironclad. And just in case anyone else is interested, because I find this stuff fascinating, I will give you a little rundown on how they do ballistics testings. I'm sure a lot of people already know, but for those of you who don't and you're curious, I'll just tell you. So when a bullet is fired through any gun, the markings on the outside of the bullet and the shell casings in conjunction with the spinning of the bullet create unique markings on the inside of the barrel of the gun, and these are called striations. As the bullet shoots forward and the casing explodes backwards at an equal force and the breech face smashes against the mechanism, that causes more unique impressions, which can also be compared. So I'm pretty sure that having, as I said, both the bullet and the casing make for a stronger comparison, because it's 2 points of comparison versus 1. But anyway, that's my little forensic tidbit for this episode. Back to our story. So the gun and the shell casings matched. Great news. Glenn Floth also needed to make sure that he had Cindy Paulson around so that she could testify. Instead of just doing this forcefully, he decided it was best to kind of create a relationship with her. Not a creepy sexual relationship, but, just trying to get her to trust him. So he started meeting with her every week and just to chat and like hear about her day and whatever, or like whatever she wanted to talk about. She was super into this. I'm sure she didn't have a lot of men or even people in her life who like just wanted to talk to her and not have sex with her and stuff. So that kind of turned into like a nice budding relationship. He had wanted it to be clear that he was not going to persecute her for any illegal activity that she was involved in, and he just really wanted her to trust him. He described her, very sadly, as basically like a child who kind of happened to end up where she did. Very sad, actually. She had ended up on the street at 12 years old and kind of just, got involved in prostitution. And he did a very good job at gaining her trust, and he was a pretty cool guy to her, apparently. Glenn also spent a bunch of time with Darla, and that was equally disturbing, but in a very different way. He learned about her and Robert's relationship, which was all kinds of fucked up, if you ask me. Darla did everything for the children and the home and the family, including paying for everything. The mortgage, the food, the clothing, the bills, everything. Darla paid for it. The bakery was Bob's, and he kept all of that money to himself to do whatever he wanted with. And like, just a side note, like, I'm not trying to mention anything specific, but like, I've just, as like an now married woman, like every time I learn about other couples' finances and like how people set things up, like it's very interesting. People do things in such different ways, and like this is just crazy. Like he's just like, you work and take care of the kids, and you pay for everything, and this is just mine. Like, what the hell? Anyway, I find it fascinating to learn about people's finances. This being probably the worst I've ever heard. But anyway, for the most part, I say, like, you know, you do you, be creative, like do what you want. But again, it's fucking crazy. Glenn said that Darla was just like, she was very like monotone, non-emotional, and like very weird. She didn't seem to be upset or angry at all. She just like, it was like she just like accepted what was going on. The only question she really asked was like how they knew that her husband was guilty. And of course they couldn't really share anything major or specific because they weren't allowed to talk about anything before the trial. But they just told her that they were positive that it was him. And she really didn't seem very shocked about this. She did seem like she kind of, for the most part, planned to like stick by him regardless, as like that's what she had done in the past. But I don't think once the actual details came out that lasted. They did not suspect that Darla knew what her husband was doing, more that she just knew that generally he was up to no good. As we talked about previously, Darla just really felt that, like, you know, if she got him to church enough that like he would change his ways. And I guess just like tried to believe that throughout her life. And obviously, unsurprisingly, that was not the case. Darla and the children, I think, have always kind of been seen more as victims of Roberts. And I think that is a very reasonable assessment. Like I mentioned, they'd been having a really hard time getting John Henning to talk. But since they were having a grand jury, they were able to subpoena him. And just like Glenn had predicted, his alibi for Robert absolutely crumbled under fear of perjury. And John admitted to lying for Robert at his request. And there you had it. That's the only thing that kept people from believing Cindy Paulson's story had been that alibi. And now that alibi was no longer. See ya. They were able to get a match on the arrowhead necklace, both from the man who gave it to Sherry as a gift and from the jeweler who sold it to that man. So that was great. Floth had been so focused on the jewelry and the weapons that he nearly forgot about that map that they also found. Remember the map with the 24 red X's indicating specific locations, mostly in and around the Nick River? Initially, he assumed that the X's were just some of Robert's favorite hunting spots or something. Like, it was a flight map, so it was like, you know, from like bird's eye view, and like he figured like this was places that he had gone hunting or something. But as he took a closer look, he noticed that 2 of the X's were on the exact spots that Sherry Morrow and Paula Golding's bodies had been found. This revelation sent Floth's head spinning. It couldn't be. Was this a map of 24 dead bodies? They obviously had to find out. Unfortunately, it was the dead of winter in Alaska, and the ground was frozen solid. So searches and possible excavations would have to wait until the spring. But Floth began looking into cases of women who were missing or already found murdered, and right away he found 2 murder cases of women who'd been found in the area whose cases were never solved. And they hadn't been linked to Robert at all, but both of them were found in spots indicated with X's on Robert's map. One of the women was named Joanna Messina, and her body had been found on the Kenai Peninsula in Seward, Alaska in 1980, and it was marked precisely with an X on that map. Joanna seemed to have been going through some major life changes. She had left her husband and family back in New York, where she was from, where she was working as a nurse, and she kind of just made her way to Alaska with her very loyal German Shepherd, and she was living in a rooming house in Seward and working at a cannery. She seemed to, like, things kind of seemed shitty for her. Like, everybody had complaints about her and her very loud dog and I don't know that there was no mention that she was a sex worker, but she did seem like kind of like a transient person and yada yada. Anyway, another body had been found near some power lines in the village of Eklutna, and this body had been found on July 17th, 1980 by some power line workers. Now, this body had been so decomposed, and she was thought to have been killed sometime in 1979, and this woman's body has never been identified. And so she's been called Eklutna Annie. And creepily, she's been associated with this photo. This, I think, is just a very old reconstruction of what they believed her to look like. The grave site that she was found in was also marked with an X on that map. So that was some major news in the investigation. Now, here's another issue they ran into. Now that they had 24 possible bodies that they were going to hopefully go dig up come springtime, they wanted to make sure that they had all of Robert's 30 guns so that they can be compared and they could get as many matches as possible to whatever bodies they found. The problem was that their original search only allowed for them to take 10 guns. They knew that the remaining 20 were still in the house and that at Robert's request, Darla could get rid of them at any time. It was crucial to get another warrant for the rest of the guns, and soon. Robert's attorney tried very hard to stop this warrant, but the map was enough evidence for the deciding judge, and the warrant was granted. And sorry you guys, it's very late. As Robert sat, I'm going to take it back because I just don't want that many flubby lubs. Robert's attorney tried very hard to stop this warrant, but the map was enough evidence for the deciding judge, and the warrant was granted. So as Robert sat in his jail cell watching, or rather hearing about all of this unfolding, he began to sweat. Now, this 4-month thing that I briefly touched on before still stood. So the team knew that it was going to be impossible to get everything they needed in order to charge him with all the murders that they believed Robert had committed in that amount of time. They wouldn't even be able to dig them up, let alone identify most of the victims until spring. So the plan had been to try to get him for the rape and kidnapping of Cindy Paulson and then work on the murder cases while Robert did time for Cindy's case. This was not ideal, but it's the route that they had to go down. This meant, though, that everything really came down to Cindy. She was the most important piece to the case, and her testimony was everything. And this was frightening because she was just a young prostitute. She was clearly on drugs, and she was living at the mercy of her pimp, who was super skeptical of law enforcement and obviously a huge dick. I mean, he's a pimp. We universally think that pimps are kind of dicks, right? Like, they're not, it's not like a sex worker agent now. I don't know. Anyway, he sounded shitty too. Anyway, Floth kept track of Cindy and developed a very close and apparently non-creepy relationship with her, as I said before. But she still kept going missing every once in a while. Every once in a while, he wouldn't be able to find her, and he would have to, like, track her down and find out that she'd start stripping at a different club. She was a stripper and also a prostitute, sex worker, whatever we're calling them nowadays. So he was starting to get very tempted to just arrest her for one of the various illegal activities she was engaging in, and that way he could keep her close by. But instead, he decided to continue trusting her and risk losing her in hopes that she would stick around. He did have a safe house for her on standby in the event that she would become desperate enough that she'd want to get out of her situation and she would go to him. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. She ended up, moving from club to club. And then one time she called him and was like, please come get me. And he did. And he just marched her out of some super creepy location right in front of the pimp. And he couldn't do anything about it. Floth had a couple other officers with him for backup. And she just took her box full of stuff and went and lived at the safe house. And Cindy moved in with this Christian family at the safe house, and she kind of got her shit together with their help, which was kind of nice. Now, while all of this was happening, Robert was getting word through his legal team about everything the detectives were uncovering. So Robert ended up making the decision to speak with the prosecution, and a meeting was set up for Robert to essentially give a confession and work out a deal. Obviously, Floth and the boys were very excited about this, but based on their last conversation with Robert, they predicted that this would not be the most straightforward conversation, and they were correct. Off the bat, Robert did admit to murdering both Sherry and Paula, so that was good. Robert would give them a bit of information, and then he would launch into some weird monologue about how he was bullied in school and had a stutter and yada yada yada. He really loved blaming other people for his behavior and really enjoyed playing the victim. That was very obvious. Floth wanted to know why Robert killed some women, but others he let go. This was something they were obviously very curious about. And this is what Robert had to say about that. Robert claimed that he would take these girls out and isolate them and threaten them with a gun. And he made them do whatever he wanted sexually. It was mostly have sex with him or give him a blowjob or whatever. And as we learned, he took them to his home first, and then he brought them onto his plane and took them out into the wilderness. He felt that he deserved to get his money's worth, and that meant keeping them longer than they wanted to stay. He claimed that if they cooperated with him and didn't fight him, that he would let them go at the end of their interaction. But when some of the women ended up trying to fight or run away, he would end up killing them.
But I really can't remember.
Where were you going to be flying Cindy Paulson in the airplane? Did you have a place in mind?
Probably going to go up on Connect River, yes.
Was there a specific place up there?
No.
Are there cabins up there that you know about that were you going to go to a cabin? Was that part of your plan?
No, sir. I'm going to just set up camp. Tent, whatever.
From what you've said before, she really wasn't interested in going with you out there.
No.
What was your plan with her?
To spend that day out there with her.
And then what?
Come back.
Where was she going to be?
She's going to come back with me.
Okay, what did you plan to do at that point?
Well, at that point, it's happened before, and I have, taken other girls out there before, and simply come back, and once I'm back with them, say, hey, you went out there against your will. Well, not all of them. Some has gone out with me. I paid the most part. That's true. But if you get back and you take them back to where they want to go and say, hey, I know you're fucking pissed off at me. You're mad. You'd like to, if you had a gun right now, you want to blow my head off or whatever. So I said, you're back. You're a prostitute. It's your word against mine. I'm going to deny if you ever bring any charges against me on it. You go your way, I'll go mine. And that's it.
Robert was really trying to portray all of these murders as accidental or not premeditated. It was a situation that got out of control, but no one was buying this. The same day as the first two confessions, he also admitted to murdering Ekletna Annie, who he couldn't identify, allegedly, and who he said had tried to run away, but he ended up stabbing her to death. And like, he's like, it just happened, like I didn't mean to, and blah blah whatever, she just died. He also admitted to killing Joanna Messina in a very similar type of situation. And Floth and the guys were very skeptical about a lot of the things that he had to say. Robert went on and on about how bad he felt for killing these women and how scared he'd been after the first one. But interestingly, he still continued to kill people. And it was very obvious that Robert was trying to appear as though he had feelings and had remorse, but every so often he would forget that he was trying to appear like a real person. When asked whether he took any girls on his plane during the winter months, Robert replied with, quote, "I could, but wintertime wasn't the time to do it. Things were dormant in the wintertime. This was a summertime project," end quote. All the guys in the room, even his own lawyers, were totally freaked out by this statement. The use of the word project is not only super creepy and cold, but it also very much implies premeditation. Even though he kept trying to imply that everything was random and like almost out of his control, the truth was that Robert was obsessive in his nature. Everything that he did was planned out to a T, just like when he went hunting for animals. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he loved every minute of it, and that was becoming very clear. Robert talked about flying the women out to the woods, and he tried to deny that he had a cabin out there, but again, no one really believed him. At some point during the first day of his confession, he seemed to kind of clam up and stopped admitting to things after about 4 murders, and everyone agreed to pick up where they left off the next day. The next day, they started again, and they were determined to get more out of Robert. I mean, they had 24 exes, for God's sake. But again, he began going off on these tangents and kind of trying to avoid the subject. Vic Crum, remember Vic Crum, the DA, he was getting frustrated, and he had it with Robert. He'd sat there for hours the day before, and he was not going to just sit there and let him go off and on again. So he got very frank with him, and he said that, of course, they were going to charge him with everything that he admitted to already, but that in the spring, they were going to use his map and go to every X on that map and look for bodies. He told Robert that whatever bodies he admitted to today that were there when they went to look for them, he would not be charged with. But if he did not admit to them now, and they later found a body at one of the X's, he would be charged for that body. So he's basically saying, we're going to charge you for 4 murders, and we're going to go look at every X, and whatever you admit to, you will not be charged with, but whatever you do not admit to and we find a body there, you will be charged additionally. I think I just repeated the same thing exactly twice, but anyway, whatever. Robert understood, and he agreed to the terms. Not that he had that much of a choice, but it was a decent deal. Robert explained that he was very fearful for his family. He didn't know what Darla was going to do. Obviously, it would be best for her to move away, but because the address of their home had been released to the public, there was no way she was going to make any money from selling the house, and he went on and on about this. Robert went on about his family and his fears for them, but I think that most of the guys believed that Robert didn't really care that much for his family, at least the way that a normal person does. They think that he saw his family as a very convenient way to appear normal, so that he could kind of look like a hardworking family man, when in reality, Darla did everything for those kids, and Robert was nothing but a financial drain and a secret rapist and murderer. And it's always interesting, this question of what these guys think about or think of their families and their children. If you are whatever Robert is, can you really love your family? I mean, do you really love them? I don't know the answer to that, but I do have strong doubts. I think that in a way, like maybe they think that was like with BTK, like BTK was a good dad to his children and like a decent husband, but it's like, do you love them? Do you know what love is? And it's interesting too, because all these guys, like, it's very clear that like they find themselves a wife and have children in order to appear normal, because that's their whole life outside of their murders is just trying to like imitate normal life. So it's very clear that like they didn't choose these women because they loved them. They chose them because they thought they would make a good they would look like a normal wife. They chose them because they knew that they were the type of women who were not going to ask questions, and they would kind of like let them go off and do whatever they wanted. And so I definitely don't think that he like cared for Darla much. It's interesting to think about the children, like, because I do think that these guys do care for their children in a way. It's kind of unclear with Robert Hansen, but like with BTK, like he tried very hard to keep in contact with his children and all that. But it's like, I don't think they love in a conventional way. They can't. There's no way. Anyway. On top of all that, Robert claimed that a number of these women were somehow related to organized crime. And so I think that was his real fear, was he feared that his family would be targets, although I think more so he feared that he would be a target in prison. Nobody was willing to give Robert any more. They thought they were offering him a pretty good deal, so they were pretty much like, sorry, like, just this is your offer, take it or leave it. And so Robert kind of basically complied with all of this. They wouldn't be able to start digging up and identifying bodies for at least 6 months. So at least he would have some amount of time to figure that shit out, and like they would let him talk to Darla and whatever. But that would have to do. So Robert agreed to fly out with them the next day and start marking trees for this springtime digging and excavation. And they had to get a very large military-level helicopter for this ride because nobody trusted Robert, and they wanted him to be seated between at least two guys. And I don't blame them. In this position, Robert I think he kind of got to feel like a sliver of what it was like to be handcuffed and forced into a plane and then brought out into the woods. So that's just like an interesting thing to think about. Like, you gotta think like he's getting in that helicopter. Like, are you comparing this to like what you did to these women? I kind of doubt it, but it's an interesting thought. So the hearing did happen, and since he did admit guilt to 4 murders, he didn't have a whole trial, but instead it was like a sentencing hearing before the judge. And I will read an excerpt from Frank Rothschild, who was the prosecutor's opening statement. It kind of wraps things up nicely. Quote, "Your Honor, before you sits a monster, an extreme aberration of a human being, a man who has walked among us for 17 years, serving us donuts, Danish, and hot coffee, all with a pleasant smile. Mellow, mild-mannered, bespectacled Bob the baker. A family man, a man so cunning, so clever, that his friends and acquaintances are in shock at what he now admits before this court. Not even his wife of nearly 20 years had any idea of his dark, evil side. He's a man who has manipulated his family, his friends, countless women, the police, and the courts of our state for many years. He has been here. He is, to be blunt, the most prolific mass murderer in modern Alaska history. A man who purposely, coldly plotted and planned the kidnap and terrorizing and rape of scores of women who lived here in Anchorage, who admits to murdering 17 women, 17 young, helpless, frightened women, and then burying them in our wilderness. His crimes numb the mind. Hearing him tell of his crimes, which we did last week for 10 to 12 hours, sapped the body of energy. It sapped the spirit. But the story must be told, for our community wants to know how it is that this man got away with these crimes all these years and how it is that we finally caught him. His manipulations are immense. And while he doesn't admit it, it's obvious from reading through and looking at where things started and where the women ended up. He hunted them down, Judge. He let them run a little bit, and then he enjoyed a little hunt, just like with his big game animals. He toyed with them. He wanted to scare them. He got a charge out of all of this. They weren't shot right where it all started. He let them run. He grabbed them and they'd claw a little bit, and he let them run a little more, and he played with them. He doesn't look big and strong, but he is. One time he called this his, quote, summertime project, end quote. What a lovely word for his handiwork, a summertime project. And he did admit that none of them went willingly. Even when he went through the map and talked about where all those women were and pointed out to us where they were, it was cold. He said, well, there's one there and here's one there, and you'll find one next to this tree and one under the road. They weren't human beings to him. He's a compulsive liar. He gives us what he knows, and he had to give us no more. So that statement is where the idea that Robert brought his victims out into the wilderness, let them go, and then hunted them down like the hunter that he was came from. And I don't believe that Robert ever really admitted to this, but I think that they figured that that's what happened based on the criminal profiling and how they found the victims, and all that kind of thing. And that is what this case has really been known for, and all the like movies and books that have come out after this, that's how they portray him. And that's fucking scary. Can you imagine? Sorry, I was looking the wrong way. Can you imagine? He kidnaps you, he brings you to his basement, he rapes you, and then he brings you to another location. He puts you on a plane, tells you he's going to a cabin, and then you land and he lets you go, and you think, oh, maybe I can run away. And then he hunts you like an animal, because that's what he thinks of women. And specifically sex workers. He thinks so little of them that he thinks it's an appropriate thing to, well, I probably didn't think it's appropriate, but he does this 17 to 24 times. So that's just insane. Insane. So at this hearing, Rothschild, the prosecutor, requested a total of 461 years. 99 years for the murder of Sherry Morrow, 99 for the murder of Paula Golding, 99 for the murder of Joanna Messina, 99 for the kidnapping of Cindy Paulson, 30 for the rape of Cindy Paulson, 25 years for 5 counts of felony weapons possession, 10 years for the 2 theft indictments, and an additional life term for the Eklutna Jane Doe case. And here is the judge's response and what he had to say at the hearing. I thought his was pretty good too, so I thought I'd include it. Quote, "It's hard to believe that humanity produces and sustains people who have the ability and the propensities to commit such enormous, such beastly, such indescribable crimes. There are no words which can adequately describe him. What we have seen here today and what the defendant has admitted to in many respects is a condemnation of society as a whole. We have let down not only the victims, but many of our compatriots here in court, here in Alaska. The court system has failed. Knowing that he was a problem, probation officers, police officers, members of society themselves who would not come forward, I can't think of a bigger indictment of society than this. And we might as well face the music and resolve now and forevermore that we're not going to allow people like this to remain on the streets. If there was ever a case in which a man or defendant needed to be surveillanced for the rest of his life, it is this gentleman here, and it's been known for many years." Side note, I think it's really funny how they'll be like, this guy was a piece of shit, awful gentleman. Like, why call him a gentleman? But what did we do? We said he paid his debt to society when we gave him sentencing, depend on psychiatrists. And here again, we've got doctors and psychiatrists are in this indictment too, as well as all of you know, I'm sure we're involved. I'm a judge and a lawyer, and so I place myself in the collective pot for criticism. Society had better take another look when you've got people like this, and there should be laws which allow you to supervise and keep some kind of control over people like this the rest of their lives if it's necessary. Here we've turned a person loose several times, knowing that he had the propensity for what he did. There's absolutely no excuse for it. There's no justification in any sense for the cruelty he's shown. In these cases, he took people who could least protect themselves, people from the standpoint of the lower point of society, but from the standpoint of a man, we're angels compared to what he has done. There just isn't much you can say of what happened here, of what this man has admitted to, of what he has placed upon society, and what society has to a great extent allowed to occur. I hope when we leave this courtroom today that I have the best of my ability, provided this man shall never walk the streets of America or any other place as a free man. End quote. And that was Judge Moody, that's his name. He agreed to give him exactly what Rothschild asked for, the 461 years. In April, they began to dig up bodies, and they had some success when were able to retrieve and identify 8 additional women. Or I think, those plus the original 4 brought their total to 12. But it is believed that there are far more and that they remain missing. Now, the additional 8 women, so they found Joanna Messina. She was found July 8th, 1980 at a gravel pit near Seward. Eklutna Annie, found July 17, 1980 at Eklutna Lake Road. Sherry Morrow, found September 12th, 1982 at the Nick River. Paula Golding, found September 2nd, 1983 at the Nick River. And then this is where they start with the excavation from the springtime. Sue Luna, found April 24th, 1984 at the Old Nick Bridge parking lot. Malai Larson, found April 24th, 1984 at the Old Nick Bridge parking lot. Delynn Frey, found April 25th, 1984 at Summit Lake. Angela Feddern, found April 26, 1984 at Figure 8 Lake. Teresa Watson, found April 26, 1984 at Scenic Lake. Tamara Pedersen, found April 29th, 1984 at the Nick River. And Lisa Fertrell, found May 9th, 1984 at the Old Nick Bridge gravel pit. There was also a woman named Andrea Altery who was never found, but her necklace was found among Robert's trophy collection, so it was believed that she was a victim. She was also known to be a prostitute in the area as well, and authorities are convinced that she was a victim. A lot of the bodies were found on the ground but not buried properly. So many of them were heavily decomposed and also very damaged by wildlife, making them difficult to identify, if at all. And the likelihood that even more of them were there but they were eaten entirely by wildlife was also very high. I also recently found out that one of his victims was identified in 2021, which is insane. This woman had been nicknamed Horseshoe Harriet for 37 years until the Alaska Bureau of Investigation and the Cold Case Unit used genealogy DNA, the genealogy database DNA, to narrow down the victim as Robin Pelkey. Robin was born in 1963 and was living in Anchorage in the 80s and would have been 19 at the time of her death. As for Robert Hansen, he served out the majority of his sentence in the state prison in Seward and was moved to the Anchorage Correctional Center in May of 2014 to receive medical attention, and he died on August 21st, 2014 of natural causes due to health conditions at the age of 75. So he lived quite a long time in prison after he was sentenced. And it all really goes to show the whole thing with Robin, who was identified in 2021, that cold cases are ending, they're not going to be a thing anymore. So anyway, that's pretty much the story. So what do you have to think about Robert Hansen's story? To me, it is yet another example of the horrific depths that resentment can lead to. Ladies, the scariest type of guy is one who feels that he's been overlooked by women and is ready to get back at all of us. Beware. And that's all for today. If you made it this far, clap on the hands for you. If you so feel that you should reach out, please comment on this video. You can find me on Instagram at Who's Knocking Podcast, Twitter at Who's Knocking Pod. Email me hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. Do you like my hat? I only made one, so sorry, but yeah, that case it's a pretty big one, and it's pretty insane. So stay safe out there, because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.